Hello and welcome to Psyched, the show where we explore psychedelics through social, economic, and political perspectives. We have Dustin Robinson. Dustin Robinson is the founding member of Mr. Psychedelic Law, a not-for-profit focused on using medical and spiritual research to drive responsible legal reform in Florida of psilocybin mushrooms and other psychedelics. Mr. Psychedelic Law has a medical advisory board consisting of the top doctors in Florida and a spiritual advisory board consisting of the top spiritual leaders in Florida. Through the Medical Advisory Board and the Spiritual Advisory Board, Dustin and his legal team have started lobbying throughout Florida for legal reform of psilocybin mushrooms and other psychedelics. Dustin, thank you so much for joining us and welcome to Psyched.
Are you guys able to see me?
We can't see you, but we can hear you.
Okay, I'm not quite sure why you can't see me, but I have a presentation anyway, so I'll just share my screen and hopefully you'll be able to see the screen that I'm sharing. Are you able to see the screen that I'm sharing?
We are not.
That's not good. Hold on just 1 second.
We see you now.
Awesome. Okay, great. Well, that is good. All right, Dustin Robinson. I'm an attorney and a CPA. I also have my real estate license. Today, what I'm going to be talking about is what the psychedelic movement can learn from the cannabis movement. Before I get into that, I'll give you a little bit background on myself and what I've been working on. Sorry, just bringing in this screen share. So I started off in the cannabis industry. My law firm is full service, and we exclusively focus on the cannabis and psychedelic industry. Previously, I was only doing cannabis stuff, and about 10 months ago, I had several of my clients in the cannabis space inquiring about getting involved in the psychedelic space. And quite honestly, I didn't know much about psychedelics. I'd actually never used them. I didn't know much. I thought it was already a little bit far-fetched that I'm even in the cannabis industry because I was kind of a late bloomer when it came to cannabis as well. So at first I wasn't so excited about getting too involved with helping them with what they were planning on doing with psychedelics. Some of them wanted to start grows out in Jamaica. Others were looking to do some retreats, stuff like that. But what I did is I actually reached out to the doctors I represent in the cannabis industry, and I wanted to get some feedback from them. And I was extremely surprised to hear that some of them were already doing ketamine treatments. And a lot of them were already very interested in doing some research related to psilocybin. In fact, one of them, Dr. Scott Fisher, he's a psychiatrist, and he's currently doing some FDA approved work here in Fort Lauderdale, studying the effects of psilocybin on depression. So once I talked to my doctors and they were very enthusiastic about the concept, I realized that there was something there. And so I started talking to people throughout the country, mainly attorneys, trying to understand what their efforts are with respect to decriminalization. Talked to guys like Kevin Matthews out of Denver, who really led the decriminalization out there. Santa Cruz, Oakland, we've had several cities that have been doing decriminalization. Then out in Oregon, of course, we have a petition for a constitutional amendment out there. So started really educating myself. I realized that there was a huge need for some legal reform. So what I did is I started a not-for-profit called Mr. Psychedelic Law. My law firm is called Mr. Cannabis Law. So that's where I conduct all my legal work and for-profit work. But the not-for-profit I started is Mr. Psychedelic Law. And our mission is to use medical and spiritual research to drive responsible legal reform of psilocybin mushrooms and other psychedelics in Florida. So we're mainly focused on Florida, but I'm working with various people throughout the country on helping them with some of their work that they're doing on legalization throughout the country. So my particular organization is really focused on Florida, and I wanted to make sure I was focused, because I see people oftentimes trying to do too much stuff, and sometimes when you do too much and get too involved in too many movements, you end up not achieving anything. So I'm very focused on it here in Florida. The Mr. Psychedelic Law team consists of 21 professionals, psychiatrists, neurologists, doctors of naturopathic medicine, pain management doctors, top lobbyists in the state of Florida, top attorneys in the state of Florida. So I know I've built a team of people that are very capable of getting the task at hand done, but it is a very tough task, and it won't be easy, and it will take several years. I have no doubt about that. So anyways, that's kind of the background on my not-for-profit. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm actually going to share my screen, because I have a presentation. Just give me 1 second. Are you able to see my screen?
Yep, you're good.
You can see the PowerPoint?
Yep.
Great. Alrighty. So we will get started with it. So basically, as I mentioned, I want to talk about what the psychedelic movement can learn from the cannabis movement. I know I talked to a lot of people in the psychedelic industry, and everyone has a different approach and a different feeling about what legalization would look like. And some people don't even like talking about the concept of it looking anything like cannabis. Obviously, these are very different substances, but the reality is they also have a lot of things in common. And when it comes to legal reform, I think there is a tremendous amount of information we can learn from the cannabis movement. So first thing to understand is that both of them have very strong stigmas that we need to break. It's deeply rooted in history, and I'm not going to go through each of these, but the pink portion at the top is about the marijuana history, and the bottom portion in blue is the psychedelic history. And what you'll see in both of them is that they both started out very long time ago. We have ancient writings all the way back from 2727 BC relating to cannabis. We have stuff going back all the way to 4000 to 7000 BC related to psychedelics. And as you move through the cannabis and psychedelic side, but then in 1936 is when the movie Reefer Madness was released, and that's when we started having some backlash, and that's really where the stigma started to be created. And then in 1937 we had the Marijuana Tax Act, and then really fast forward to 1970. This is when President Richard Nixon signed into law the Controlled Substances Act. So that's the cannabis history. And on the psychedelic side, once again, I won't read through this, but right here you'll see Harvard University was doing tremendous research related to psychedelics back in 1960 to 63. There was a lot of exciting research being done, but fast forward to 1970, and once again, Richard Nixon signed into law the Controlled Substances Act. So we're in a situation right now where both of cannabis and some of these psychedelics have, specifically psilocybin mushrooms, are Schedule I substances. So the question is, how do we move towards some sort of decriminalization or legalization when we're dealing with a substance that is a Schedule I controlled substance? So the first thing really to understand is the difference between decriminalization and legalization. I hear people confusing these terms all the time. Decriminalization means it's still illegal. Generally, when something's being decriminalized, it's just kind of reducing the punishment to maybe a fine or a civil infraction. So you'll see this with on the cannabis side, where if you have a certain amount of grams of marijuana, you might just get a citation. So that's decriminalization. Or you'll see cities or states just not allocating resources to prosecuting people for committing these crimes. That doesn't mean that it's legal. It just means that it's decriminalized. On the legalization side, you see this with recreational drugs, alcoholic beverages, prostitution, gun ownership. So in these areas, generally they're legal, but they may be regulated and taxed, and there's an absence of an actual punishment as long as you're operating under that regulated structure. One of the examples I give here, and I get a lot of calls, the 2018 Farm Bill legalized hemp from a federal perspective. So, I get people calling me asking if they could grow hemp in their home. And the Florida law doesn't allow you to grow hemp in your home. It has to be zoned as either agricultural or industrial. And they always, a lot of people respond, they say, but I thought that it was legalized. I can do whatever I want with hemp. And I have to remind them that just because something is legalized doesn't mean it can't be regulated. So, even if we get to the point of federal legalization, hemp will be highly regulated, marijuana will be highly regulated, and psychedelics will also be highly regulated. So the path to decriminalization and legalization is going to be a long one. The path for cannabis, really, it started at a city level where cities decided not to allocate resources to prosecuting cannabis crimes. Then it went up to state decriminalization. Once again, that's different than legalization. The state started to decriminalize. Then you went to medical. Then you went to pharmaceutical, and now what we're seeing is several states having recreational. So that's kind of been the path, and it's been a very long path. If you see at the very bottom here, I have kind of a chart of how it came about. Once again, 1937, we had the Marijuana Tax Act. Then 1970, we had it put as a controlled substance, but then California voters in 1999 kind of created the first medical marijuana industry. And then in 2022, we had progression with Colorado and Washington becoming online. And at this point, we have 39 states that have legalized medical marijuana in some form. And we have 12 states, plus the District of Columbia, that have legalized for recreational use. So the cannabis movement has come a very, very long way, but there's still, a lot that still needs to be accomplished. It's still federally illegal, and we still have states that have not, a lot of states that have not legalized it from a recreational perspective. So if you look at the path for psychedelics, I think it will have to follow a similar path way. And I get a lot of people who on the psychedelic side, and I have to remind them, it's fine if that's what your ultimate goal is, but we have to find what is the best way we can do this based on the political environment. So regardless of what you think, where you want us to end up with psychedelics, I believe what's going to have to happen is that we're going to have city decriminalization, and that's what we're seeing with Denver, Santa Cruz, and Oakland. Then you need state decriminalization. That's what they're trying to do right now in Colorado and California. And then you have the psychotherapeutic, which is really the medical, the pharmaceutical, and then you have entheogenic, which is kind of recreational. And I'll talk a little bit about each of those in the upcoming slides. So states will decriminalize and legalize at different rates. You're already seeing that Colorado and California, just like they were leaders in the cannabis movement, they're also leaders right now on the psychedelic movement, as far as their cities getting involved. And I would envision that California and Colorado would be the first states to really have some sort of statewide decriminalization. And of course, Oregon is up there as well, as they already have a petition for a constitutional amendment. The laws will vary from state to state, which really makes things very complicated from an operational compliance perspective. I represent multi-state operators in the cannabis space, and what people don't realize is that other companies that are not cannabis, when they have a multi-state operation, one of their benefits is economies of scale, and they put forth standard SOPs that they could spread across all of their operations throughout the country. In cannabis, you can't really do that because every state has their own laws with respect to how you could produce it, with respect to what you need to put on the labels, with respect to licensing structure. So it's very complicated because you may have a multi state operator, but you may have different layers trying to get set up. It's important that they understand that it's going to be a patchwork framework when it comes to states creating different types of law. And that's what the 10th Amendment of our United States Constitution is for, is the states will be laboratories of experimentation, and they'll take different approaches, and ultimately the best approaches in given states will start to be adopted by other states. Schedule 1 classification means that operators will face obstacles to obtain access to traditional banking. Obviously, in cannabis, that is an enormous issue and a big challenge that I have to deal with quite frequently. Also very hard to find financing. What we're seeing right now is a lot of the psychedelic companies that are forming on the Canadian Stock Exchange through RTOs. And that's how a lot of the marijuana businesses got started. Most of the multi-state operators currently for cannabis are also listed on the Canadian Stock Exchange, and most of them did that through an RTO as well. And then the 280E tax issue is something to keep in mind. That is extremely burdensome for these companies. I cannot stress that enough. And in addition to being an attorney, I'm also a CPA, so I help a lot with the tax structuring on the cannabis side. And 280E, I could do a 2-hour presentation on 280E, but I won't get into it too much. But for purposes of this, for this presentation, it's important to understand that will be a very big hurdle as we move through decriminalization and legalization of psychedelics. So what are the psychotherapeutic advocates? What could they learn from the medical cannabis movement? So really right now there's two kind of sides of this psychedelic movement. There's the psychotherapeutic advocates, and they believe more so in the medical value. They believe that the psychedelics stem from the belief that the legal movement should focus on the medicinal value of these substances and should be administered by individuals that traditionally administer medicines. On the other side, you have the entheogenic advocates that are really more focused on the spiritual side of things, and they really believe in freeing the plant and allowing people to use it under at their own volition, without putting too much regulation on it being medical. But what you're going to see is qualifying conditions in our legal framework, such as depression, PTSD, addiction. You're going to see older demographic of consumers in the cannabis space. You'd be shocked in Florida, out of our almost 400,000 patients, a vast majority are of the older population. Doctor-patient relationships, you're going to see that medical professionals with specialized training in psychedelics will be the main advocates there, and you're going to see a standardized product offerings when it's medical. And also medical products will most likely be paid entirely out of pocket. In the cannabis industry, even if you have a medical marijuana card, you still have to pay out of pocket. Insurance is not covering that. That's another thing that the cannabis industry is working on, and that will certainly, if we could get that through on the cannabis side, that would help tremendously. But it's important to understand that even the advocates, the psychotherapeutic advocates, need to understand that we are a long ways away from this stuff being covered by insurance. Now, on the flip side is the pharmaceutical approach. So this is when things would potentially be covered by insurance. So any drug that's a controlled substance that's listed in Schedule 2, 3, 4, 5, it must be dispensed by prescription. So the FDA approved Marinol in 1985. It basically put Marinol as a Schedule 3 substance, even though THC and marijuana are Schedule 1. You've also seen this with Epidiolex, where it gets rescheduled. But you're seeing the same thing happen with psychedelics. In October 2018, Compass Pathway received FDA Breakthrough Therapy designation for psilocybin therapy for treatment-resistant depression. So you're starting to see the FDA, from a federal perspective, starting to recognize the possibility of these therapeutic benefits. And then in November 2019, Usona Institute, they received breakthrough therapy designation for psilocybin in the treatment of major depressive disorder. And like I mentioned at the beginning of this session, I actually have one of the members of our Mr. Psychedelic Law team, Scott Fisher, is working with USONA right here in Fort Lauderdale on some of those clinical trials. So very excited to stay abreast of that. What the entheogenic advocates can learn, and I'm going to kind of rush through these because I'm running a little bit low on time. But entheogenic is really, you're still going to have people who are 21 years or older. So this is really referring to more of the recreational model. It's going to be a younger demographic. You're going to have increased product offerings. You're going to have states adopting medical marijuana industry first and then recreational. So really what I'm trying to convey through this presentation is that regardless of whether you believe in the psychotherapeutic, the pharmaceutical, or the entheogenic approach, I think it's very important to understand that we're probably going to have to prove that there's medicinal value first, and get some sort of medicinal legal framework before we move towards any sort of recreational framework. And even a recreational framework will certainly look very, very different than the recreational cannabis framework. I doubt you're going to be just having coffee shops or stores that are just selling these products outright. It's going to be a very different legal framework, but we need to crawl before we walk. And I think that crawling involves having some sort of medical framework prior to a recreational framework. There's also the caregiver model. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but caregiver model, it combines all aspects of psychotherapeutic and entheogenic. I gave some examples on here about some of the states that have the caregiver approach, and it really advocates for home grow. In some of these states, they allow caregivers to grow some amount of plants, and I can see a similar model potentially developing in these other, with respect to psychedelics, with the caregiver approach. And we're seeing in Denver with the legalization, people are starting to do home grow, and they're selling tons of pods out there. I work with a not-for-profit out there, and they're helping people with doing home grow. And you'd be shocked at how much demand there is right now on some of the pods that they're selling. And the location shapes the experience. This goes to the old saying, set and setting. What's interesting is that the marijuana industry, most of them say that marijuana needs to be consumed within the home. But it's interesting because Oregon's approach, and where I see the approaches being taken in the future in other states, is they're probably going to have it done under the supervision of a trained therapist. That's very, very different than allowing the use within your home. In the cannabis world, once again, they actually want it. In Florida, you can only do it in a private home. Now, there's some states, recreational states, that allow it in social settings. I don't see social settings being a reality in the near future for psychedelics, but I certainly see the reality being that you'll probably have to go through a supervised, trained therapist and do it under their care, and it will develop from there. Greed may not be good. We've seen this in the cannabis industry. I've been very careful at my not-for-profit to not take any money yet. I probably will eventually have to, but so far I've self-funded most of the work that we're doing, and I'm very proud that I've done so. It's allowed me to really not focus on the bottom line or have to, be for anyone with any sort of business interest. So we're really focused on what's right for the people out there and the public at large. And that's kind of the approach that we're taking. So at Mr. Psychedelic Law, I kind of went over the mission already, to use medical and spiritual research to drive responsible legal reform. And I capitalize that responsible because I'm not really here to take one side or the other. Really what I want to do is gather data, gather information, and make sure that we have a responsible legal framework that takes into consideration the positive benefits, but also the potential abuse and negative benefits. And that's really what I'm focused on. I don't only want to learn the good. It's important that we also learn the bad. And through learning the good and the bad, that's how we're going to be able to develop a good, responsible legal framework. This is just my medical advisory board, my spiritual advisory board, my legal lobbying team. You can see here, we've got all sorts of different doctors with various backgrounds. We have some great spiritual advisors on our team. We also have top legal and lobbying advisors as well. Our approach is to decriminalize from a city perspective. Once we get 3 to 5 cities on board, I want to start working on it from a state perspective. And simultaneously, my medical advisory board and spiritual advisory board are helping various organizations with clinical trials to further federal psychedelic research, along with providing spiritual guidance. So that's our approach here at Mr. Psychedelic Law. And I think my time is up, so I'm going to open it up for questions.
Dustin, thanks so much. We really appreciate it. I was hoping you could tell us a little bit about kind of the international climate around psychedelics. Do you see that we're going to be able to have some openings, not just in Jamaica and the Netherlands, but other countries as well over the next 5 years, for instance? Or do you think it'll roll on similar to cannabis with the US and Canada decriminalizing, legalizing first, and then allowing for that to proliferate to other countries?
Yeah, time will tell, but I think that obviously the countries that are currently already allowing it, they're certainly at the forefront, and taking trips out there to learn about a trip planned to Jamaica to see how things are going out there. I have a couple clients that actually have grows out there and retreats. So I think it'll be exciting to see how that's being integrated into their society. I have not made it out to the Netherlands, but they allow magic truffles out there, which is kind of a legal loophole. I have people that get mad at me when I call it. I posted something on LinkedIn calling it a loophole, and I had a bunch of Netherlands advocates that got after me. But it is somewhat of a legal loophole. They don't allow psilocybin mushrooms, but they allow the truffles. And I call it a loophole. They say it's not a loophole because it's purposeful. But just because something's purposeful doesn't mean that it's not a loophole. But I don't, the way it should progress, I'm very focused here on the United States. I think different countries are certainly coming online, and they're going to try to, chart their own path. The opportunity in cannabis. Jamaica could have been a leader in cannabis, and I've talked to several political people out there that are heads of governments out there, and they are disappointed that they missed the boat with the cannabis movement, and that's why they are taking a very, very strong approach on the psychedelic movement. They do not want to miss this psychedelic opportunity. So I'm actually working with some of the members of their government to bring in further investment from the United States into Jamaica, because they do not want to miss this the way they missed the cannabis boom. But United States is certainly coming online with some of these cities decriminalizing, and certainly I'm watching the Oregon movement very, very closely. I think you'd be shocked at how open. I've been talking to a lot of the cities in Florida, and the commissioners are extremely receptive. Obviously, at first, when I tell them what I'm trying to do, they kind of step back. But after I bring in the doctors that psychiatrists I'm working with, and we bring in some of the people that have been cured through, we have members that have been cured through PTSD, addiction. We bring in some of those people, and we speak in front of these city commissioners. And I'll tell you, interested. I've already drafted several of those cities prior to the pandemic. Unfortunately, I think the pandemic has slowed things down. I think if the pandemic didn't happen, we'd probably have several cities in Florida that have already decriminalized. But unfortunately, it's okay. We got delayed for a few months, but we're getting back at it. But we're going to see this spreading throughout the country. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. So I do think it will take significant amount of time. This is not an easy task, but we got to get started on it.
Definitely. One of our questions from the audience is, how do cannabis companies obtain access to banking these days? And what can psychedelic companies learn from that approach?
You kind of broke up on that. You mind repeating that?
Yeah, of course. So how are cannabis companies obtaining access to banking services? And what can psychedelics companies do to learn from that approach?
Yeah, so, you'd be surprised. A lot of banks now are doing banking. So, most of the cannabis companies I work with, they do have some form of banking. Sometimes those are community banks or, smaller banks that are doing that. I have my go-to banks here in Florida that, I know that they'll bank cannabis companies. Now there's high fees, they charge a fee. They have to file SARS reports, so suspicious activity reports. And that's really why a lot of the banks stay away from it. They don't want to, they don't have a framework for, doing a SAR report for every single transaction. And that's what's required. So if a bank is not set up to handle a cannabis business, that bank to take on a cannabis business. So what you're seeing is some of these smaller banks taking on cannabis businesses and building out that framework so that they could file those suspicious activity reports as needed. But it's very challenging and it's very costly. I mean, operating in the cannabis industry, people think, you know, you're just printing money. Now, you know, it's easy to produce marijuana and sell it at a profit, but with all the compliance restrictions, it makes it extremely costly from a banking perspective, tax perspective, all those things. So from a psychedelic perspective, very challenging. Even for my not-for-profit, I had challenges opening up my bank account. I had challenges opening up my law firm's bank account because the name of my firm is Mr. Psychedelic Law, or Mr. Cannabis Law. So, you know, I think you got to be very careful, and I would definitely work with an attorney to make sure. I don't want to give any legal advice. Definitely recommend working with an attorney. There are loopholes and there's ways around some things that you could get banked, but it's definitely going to be a challenge for the industry.
You mentioned the point of loopholes and that word loophole earlier on. One of the things that I think we saw in cannabis was many of these, you know, large for-profits, you know, people with a lot of capital coming in and using loopholes to really be able to, in some ways, take a more extractive approach to cannabis, really being able to kind of compile the amount of licenses that they had to be able to kind of, you know, take particular swaths of the market. We saw a lot of, you know, loopholes or, you know, possible problems with legislation pushing people of color out and the formerly incarcerated out of the cannabis industry. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about, you know, what is the legal infrastructure and the policy infrastructure that we need to have to be able to not repeat those mistakes for psychedelics?
Absolutely. Part of your question was breaking up, but I think I got the gist of it. So I actually just recently worked on several Illinois marijuana applications. I did about 10 of them. And Illinois has a really, really strong social equity framework for applying. They give 20% of the points are allocated for social equity applicants, and those are people who have been disproportionately impacted by the war on drugs, which generally includes minorities. And so I worked with pretty much all of my groups were social equity applicants. Really, there's no point of applying in Illinois if you don't have a social equity applicant because you're giving up about 20% of the points. So several states have come out with some really good social equity programs. Unfortunately, smart attorneys have sometimes found loopholes with that and kind of drafted documents to get around the social equity by kind of putting a social equity person on the front end of it, but having some sort of buyout agreement on the back end of it. So, you know, it doesn't necessarily serve its purpose. So I think that's something you got to be very careful about when you're drafting these legal frameworks for the social equity. But I'll tell you, I worked very closely with Minorities for Medical Marijuana, Eric on my Mr. Psychedelic Law team specifically for that reason. I told him his job is to make sure that the minority population and the people that have been disproportionately impacted by the war on drugs are well represented in this psychedelic movement. So Eric Range is heading that up for my organization, and I think we need to continue to have that conversation at the forefront of this movement.
Dustin, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate your time and looking forward to talking more soon.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
Have a good one.